Hi, and welcome to Partners in Progress, a couples podcast about love, life, and well-being in your 20s with me, Eloise.
And me, Sammy.
In this podcast, we'll be discussing topics like relationships, health, well-being, spirituality, and just life. From tips and tricks to failures and falls, all while sharing our story as we try to figure out building and growing a life together in the chaos of modern-day society. We'll be coming to you every Sunday with our shares and invite some guests to share their experiences too. So grab a blanket, a cuppa, and settle in to Partners in Progress. Hello and welcome back to Partners in Progress. So this week we've spoken about doing this for I think in a few episodes now, but we're finally going to be talking about Sammy being Swedish and what that means to you.
To me, yes.
And I think it's going to be kind of not really like interview style, but like more obviously focused on you because I am 100% British.
Not Swedish, I guess.
Yeah. So, and I think we'll have a few episodes in this kind of style. So it will be a kind of focused on like one of us more than another because it's a particular topic that relates strongly to one of us rather than the other. So yeah, we will get into it, I suppose. Is there anywhere that you particularly want to kind of start?
I'm thinking off the top of my head. I guess I could start with how my family kind of relates to Sweden to begin with, because I feel like that's a kind of natural starting point. So my mum is the one who's on the Swedish side of my family, my mama, as I call her, which is the Swedish way of saying it. So yes, she moved over with my mormor, who is my mum's mum, when she was quite young to England and grew up here in Yorkshire. And then from that, they'd kind of go back to Sweden fairly regularly. And obviously, once I was born, I would go to Sweden pretty much like twice a year every year for the entire time I was in school, so for up to sort of 6 weeks a year. And I think the first time I went to Sweden, I was only about 2 or 3 months old. So I've been going pretty much since they would let me on a plane, I think.
Do you want to talk a bit about what like going to Sweden means for like where you're going and that information?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I feel like I say this like people know what I'm talking about to begin with, and I'm like, wait, I should actually explain it. So yeah, going to Sweden for our family meant going to, for the most part, to these kind of little houses that we owned in a forest, very very in the middle of nowhere. I think is always the way to describe it. It's like literally is in the forest, and there's not really shops for a few miles around either side, I don't think. And you can't really get anywhere without driving around there, but that's just because of where we are. I think again the cities are always very drivable.
So it's very much like southwest rural Sweden, right?
Yeah, it's a few hours away from Gothenburg, if people know where that is, which is kind of in the south of Sweden. And it's just a little bit away from there. It's not too far from the sea either down there. So it's about half an hour's drive from that. So you got the sea nearby, you got the forest nearby, everything you can need, really.
Yeah. And so that when did your mormor like get the land that because wasn't it just a piece of land before like the houses built? There was one of the houses were and there weren't there.
Yes, so I think we'll found out about that piece of land from I always try and connect family members up. I'm just going to say, from her brother, Eva, who lived really close by there, as there was this land that I forget exactly who it was, but I know it was someone who was close to them and was kind of known in the family was selling. And I think that was around like 4 or 5 at this point. So kind of she went over, or we all went over, and we were kind of to have a look. I think she might have gone over first. And again, my memory's a bit hazy on all this because I was 4 or 5. So we went over, and to begin with, there was like a camper van there, which was not in the best state. And there was what I think it was at one point like kind of a house. It was more of like a fancy shed, if anything. It didn't even have like a toilet within it. The toilet was like down the side, so a lot of it was quite flat, and it had a few little trees and things on it, and some quite big trees as well on this piece of land. But then it also had this big sort of ditch towards the back of it where all the water would kind of run off to, and the toilet was halfway down there on the slope, just like they had these little sort of metal stairs that were dug into the ground that I don't think were sturdy from the time that they were that we were there, at least, and they led down halfway to this toilet. So yeah, it was like you had it for the first 4 or 5 steps, but then you had another 4 or 5 steps after that, where there was nothing. So you just kind of had to hope for the best. And then, if I remember correctly, it was in like a very little sort of like shack type thing. So it was only really big enough for the toilet and a very little bit of room to kind of stand or sit on it. And then that was all that was there, really. So aside from that, there were some trees, and quite a lot of trees, and that was about it. So that's how it started out. And then I think Wilma came there, and she was very much like had a vision for this place,
of course,
from pretty much from when she saw it, I think, especially with the shed / what became the house. As to begin with, she was just like, oh, I can see exactly how all this is going to go. I remember that I think some other family were there, and they were like, okay, I don't fully see it yet, but we'll trust you.
As they should.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it turned out really nicely. But yeah, from that, I think they were then, there's one other bit I remember about that period of time there is when I was there as well. They were talking about kind of signing off whatever agreements for buying it. And I think they hadn't agreed at that point that they were going to buy it. But I was convinced, I really liked it from that age as well, apparently. And I was so convinced that I grabbed the for sale sign and carried it inside. I pulled it out of the ground and walked over, and I was like, well, we got it now, don't worry. So, yeah, I think I was trying to help the deal go through, which I mean ended up happening.
That's so sweet.
But also,
that's all right. So what would you like? You obviously went there for like 6 weeks. So how would you spend your time when you were there in Sweden?
That's a really good question. I think, again, with it being out in the middle of nowhere, a lot of it was just kind of being connected to nature, really. So I spent a lot of time, it kind of evolved from, obviously, I was saying, like, got it when I was 4 or 5. So at that age, it was very much just kind of playing games outside or inside, depending on the weather. I remember I was very into teddies at that point in my life, little teddy bears. And every year I'd always bring my favorites over. It would be like the top 5 or to 10 of that year, because I remember well that was the point where I was like, allowed to pack my bag, but being a kid at that age, you're like, I don't really have anything important to bring, so I just packed it full of teddies and then like a few books, I think. And I had them all laid out on my bed, I remember, and I was like, right, you're coming. Aww. You didn't make the cut this year, I'm sorry. So some of them would be feeling sad and dejected while I was away. But yeah, be playing games with them. I remember a lot of it kind of came from whatever video games I was playing at the time, because that was another big part of it. As I got my Nintendo DS when I was 5 or 6, so they kind of all coincided, and that was obviously very handy to have a handheld console when you're traveling over and when you're there, and there was no like Wi-Fi or anything. I mean, there still isn't Wi-Fi there now because of how remote it is. I think it's like we could get it, but it would also be really expensive and not a good connection or anything anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be that, and then playing games with the teddies based on whatever DS ones. So I remember I'd be doing some racing ones based on like Mario Kart, and then based on other Mario games as well, and all sorts of things like that. So that kind of evolved while I was in primary school. I think that was the most of what we did, like on the land itself. Aside from that, again, I mentioned we've got like the sea nearby, and we did have a lot of family and friends who are not super far away, so we'd still go and see them fairly regularly as well, to just say hi. And I'd always bring some form of toys with me, most likely some of the top 3 teddies as opposed to the top 10, and introduce them to everyone as well. So.
I like how I ask you like what you did in Sweden and you just talk about your teddy.
Well, yeah,
I was full on
expecting
you to talk about like the islands and like the zoo and the lake nearby and all those things. It's like teddies.
Well, I think that's what I was saying in the years, because I think like we did do that stuff, and I'll go more into that in a bit, but I feel like that didn't really make as much of an impact on me until I was a bit older, because I think the main thing I remember from like the younger years is just like spending so much time playing and having fun and that.
Being
and
a kid.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was the perfect place for that, because it's just like so much space and you can just do whatever, and you're not really affecting anyone. I think the nearest neighbour's like half a mile away, really, so it's like you can be as loud as you want and no one cares.
It's so unique to have that, like, especially I feel like now where there's a lot of like social media and digital kind of use, and there's a lot of screen time and things, especially like here where we are now, where we're like in a city. So, and although like obviously we grew up in like the noughties and tens, so it was still kind of a lot of like technological progress was happening, you know, like Facebook and stuff kind of started coming about. But the fact that you had like this a lot of like time away from school, but you also had it like away from all of those kind of pressures and stuff, and you could literally just be a kid. There's no Wi-Fi, there's no, you know, I mean, I know screens you were playing on your DS, but you were very like,
doesn't count.
It gave you, I feel like it must have been a very good place for kind of allowing like creativity and just a state of being to happen, even though you wouldn't necessarily be aware of that at the time.
No, I think it's one of those that, like, when I reflect on that period now, it's like I really do think of that, because I'd always just be thinking about like coming up with games, and like I remember I've probably got sketchbooks full of things somewhere of like designing games, and I used to also be into like trading cards and stuff around that time, so I'd like create my own and have notebooks just filled with that, and also just random pieces of paper probably floating about somewhere with random whatever I decided was worth creating at that time. So yeah, and again, I'm very aware it's a very unique sort of situation to have been in, and also very fortunate to have had it. But I think it's just had such an impact on kind of my interest in other things we talked about before, like games and music, because that's sort of like, again, getting onto like sort of the secondary school, like teenage years and things. I think that's when I did become more aware of like where we were actually going and what we were doing when we were going places. I think it's like, as a kid, you just kind of get taken to like, oh, we're going to see family on like wherever, and we're going to do this, and it's just kind of like, okay, and it's just the thing you do without thinking. But yeah, getting older, there are a lot of things especially that really stood out to me. I think one you mentioned was going to like the islands. So that's where my mormor grew up. There's a few islands right on the edge of Sweden, not too far from Gothenburg, called Fita and Herne, and that's where my family, all the way back to like my great grandfather, my gamla morfar, and well beyond that, would have grown up there. And it's just such an amazing place, really. It's like, it does feel like it's right on the edge of the world, because it's like you can look out over so much of it and just see nothing but sea, and there's so many amazing places just going for walks like over all these rocks, and going swimming and everything like that. And there was like a big fishing culture there, because it was a big fishing area. That was the main source of jobs and everything for people there, well, a long time ago, like when my mum was growing up and things. But obviously there's still a lot of family there now. So some of my mormor's brothers and sisters live on that island, so whenever we go there, we'd always see them. And literally every time we go there, even the most recent times, she'll just start chatting to someone and be like, oh, your Franz, who's like my gamla morfar's like daughter, is, oh, like we know this person who knows them through this, and then just always ends up chatting to someone that she knew like 50, 60, 70 years ago, and it's just like, oh yeah, now I'll just chat to them like it's nothing. And it's like, it's so crazy, because it's all this sort of sense of community there, which is so strong.
I remember you couldn't go like because I went to the islands once when I came along to Sweden, and I remember us going through the islands and like not being able to get like 10 meters without like your mom spotting someone that she knew and having this conversation, and I was just there with like wide eyes like, wow, this is crazy.
And yeah, it is worth saying it's quite like a small island as well, so it's quite impressive that it's probably only got a few thousand people living between the two of them, and probably Footer's only got like a few hundred, I think, so it's quite small. But yeah,
what do you think of them, like, is your experience of the cultural differences between like England and Sweden?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's definitely like quite a few, but they're more subdued than they would be between like further extreme cultures, I think.
There's a lot of similarities, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. I think a lot of it, it's hard to like pinpoint them exactly because obviously I've grown up with both, and I feel like my brain's just kind of merged them together into one set of kind of cultural standards. But I think when I look at it now, if I'm trying to look from a new perspective, I think one is like people in Sweden can be quite blunt. I think that's one thing that people tend to say, of like to be a stereotype, I guess, of like people just saying what they mean and being honest with it and not really mincing words, which I think is definitely true. Again, I think from what I've heard, it can sometimes be more in the work culture, but I've not experienced that at all because I've never worked in Sweden, so I don't know. But yeah, I think when I think about it, it's like people can just say it, but you just get used to it, I think. And again, it's like I don't really think much of it when people are saying stuff like that. I think other ones, it's hard to say because I'd say almost as a country, there's probably are like more religious, but I think that's again, it might just be the family I've known and things like that are more so. But again, it's not like an extreme level or anything. It just feels like it's just different. But there's a lot that it has in common with England, I think, in terms of like the cultural kind of standards.
Well, I know you've spoken about a couple things like their approach to welcoming people into the country and how they treat things like taxes and like the kind of rehabilitation stuff, which I don't think is like that common knowledge.
Yeah, no, that's true. So yeah, I'll preface this by saying this is things that I am aware of to an extent. They might have changed since I was aware of them, but
this is like your experience.
This is my experiences, so
the cultural differences, isn't it?
But yeah, when people kind of are migrating into Sweden or things like that, a big part of it is I think there's a lot of government initiatives and things like that to really help them get integrated into society. So they do provide like lessons for learning Swedish for free and things like that to really just kind of help integrate people into the culture more, which seems to be like really successful from what I've seen and people I've spoken to in Sweden, to just help everyone kind of come together more as a society and help support anyone joining it, because obviously that's a big change for anyone moving to a new country for whatever reasons that people have to do that. And I just think that's a really positive way of doing it, rather than just kind of letting people in and essentially just saying, right, now figure it out. Because it's not, obviously with so many changes and not everyone will have family or friends pre-existing. So I think that's one thing that's definitely unique, at least compared to England. Again, I don't know if other Scandinavian countries do that. They probably do.
I suppose thinking about like because before you, I hadn't, that I know of, met anyone. Well, I had met someone that was Swedish. We had one of my sister's uni friends was Swedish, and funnily enough was called Sammy, or Sunny. So it's very like similar to Sammy.
Close to me. Yeah.
A bit of foreshadowing there. But like in terms of what I think I knew of Sweden is that it was a lot of like tall, blonde, blue eyes.
Yeah.
Very like healthy, sporty kind of mindset. Saunas and like hot, like those kind of things were quite common. Or like that, you know, you hear of like Swedish in like spa places, you get like Swedish massages, and and I feel like there's a kind of sauna thing to, I don't know what it is, but that's one of the things I knew. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I knew. Obviously IKEA, which is actually IKEA. Which is obviously, so that kind of like I knew a bit about like the kind of Scandi colours and like style, which I took to mean that they were very intentional about kind of like minimalistic, simple but functional furniture, and so kind of translating that into the personality of the Swede, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's also fair. And another one I always think about is, or not always think about, but the thing about now is like the weather is also extremely different in terms of like the amount of snow that they can get in Sweden is like much more than in the UK, especially depending on where you go. Because like the more north you go, you're getting up towards Antarctica or the Arctic, or whichever one it is.
Cold.
Arctic Circle. So yeah, you're going to be getting closer up to that. And sometimes up there, it's like, I think I mentioned before, you can get areas where it's literally dark almost.
Yeah.
Like for 3 or 4 months straight. Yeah, I mean, in the UK or something where it gets dark after 5 p.m. every day, it's like, imagine that, but it's dark for all the time, or like it gets light at 10 and gets dark at 12.
And then the opposite with summer.
Yeah, and then you have it where it's light for almost all the time as well. So it's quite extreme conditions, and I mean, I think that's part of the reason that basically all of the big Swedish cities are in the southern half of the country, because it's like more relatively normal cycles in terms of like the day and night throughout the entire year.
So it's the more north you get, the longer,
the more extreme it is. Yeah. And again, it's like, if you look at a map on Sweden, you'll see, I think a lot of the population is concentrated around like Gothenburg, Stockholm, and Malmö. They're like the big 3 cities, and they're all like all way under the midpoint of the country, I think, which I just think is interesting. And yeah, the snow, it's sometimes can get insane over there. I think even in like April, when we'd go over for like the Easter holiday, sometimes it would be tall enough to go probably 2 or 3 foot of snow when you just drive in, if it's just been untouched. And because of that, around a lot of roads, especially like smaller ones, they have these massive ditches either side to let the water kind of drain off, or the snow to kind of fall in, which is good, but I think it's always seemed slightly stressful. I think my dad's mentioned the first few times he went over there, and he's not Swedish, he was born in England. He said he'd get nervous about like just driving into them, essentially, because some of them are really like 7 or 8 feet deep, and or just like some of them just fall straight off depending on where you are. But again, it's like they're fairly wide then, and they're safe roads, obviously. But yeah, it's just another thing that like they're used to there, but you just wouldn't be. You'd strike you, I think, if you went there.
So thinking about being in England now, but being like half Swedish, how do you feel like your maternal side, obviously being Swedish, come into your life, like living obviously predominantly, living in England?
Yeah. I think it's a interesting one, because I always feel like being Swedish is such a big part of my identity, but whenever I do go to Sweden, I always feel like more English than Swedish, I think. So, I mean, in fairness, I am, because I've lived in England much more than I've lived in Sweden, especially in recent years. And I never really lived in Sweden a long time. I've only ever been there for holidays, but obviously with some of them being very long, it does feel like you're living there for a while. So I think I do try and kind of keep it as part of me and keep parts of the culture with me. I think, again, I always get excited when we go to IKEA, and I'm always down for a trip there.
The meatballs.
And yeah, a lot of the food there is very reminiscent of
the dime cheesecake.
Dime cheesecakes, yeah. Can confirm you get them. Very common in Sweden, and then, as you should, everywhere, I think, but that's a separate point. And yeah, I think it's a lot of like the food and the sweets and things like that. I mean, there's some of the food that's I'm not a big fan of. Like, I do like fish and things like that, but not necessarily to the extremes that you can get in Sweden. But I think, yeah, all the sweets and things like that, and I just like try and keep it as part of my identity, really. But I feel like that kind of never has like a static form of like, oh, I always do this because it's Swedish. It's just like ideals and things like that are just kind of ingrained in me as part of that. And it's
what kind of like ideals, and kind of how do you feel like is your way of being Swedish in England?
I think sometimes my just approach to things, I think it's kind of what you're saying about the functional design with things and like the functional logic. I think that's just something that I feel is a really strong part of who I am. It's like, if there's any problem, my first thing is always just like, right, how do we solve this? I mean, that's also what my job is to an extent. So it's like, it makes sense, but I feel like that's the kind of attitude I've learned from like being in Sweden and being around people, because it's not that there's not any time for emotion or anything, there very much is, but it's just that thing of planning out and things like that, I feel like comes from the Swedish half of me. And then I think also just kind of trying to talk about Sweden and let other people know about it, I think feels like I'm at least sharing that knowledge, because it's not a country that's necessarily super well known, I don't think. I feel like it gets mentioned now and then for various things, but and obviously IKEA is the biggest export, and along with ABBA and Avicii and things like that. But yeah, it is more of a country that's known for a few things rather than a country that's known as a culture as a whole. I mean, I'm sure anyone from any country in Europe would probably argue the same thing in the UK, that they're known for a few things and that's it. But I think when it's one that you're obviously from and attached to, you feel it more than other countries. So
you definitely as well like present quite Swedish looking in terms of like your height and like physical characteristics, I feel like, and I feel you appreciate like that as a way of expressing as well, and the fact that you're just naturally built Swedish.
yeah, because I think that's one thing that I always find it fun talking about, because I feel like I'm definitely tall in terms of like English standards, but in Sweden I'm very much like average height. Because I'm about like 6'3". I think I might be like slightly on the taller side in terms of average on Sweden, but especially when it's like big family gatherings and things like that, I would very much be like fairly slap bang in the middle on height. So there'd be people who are like 6'7" and just insanely tall and things like that there, and I'm just like, oh hello, just looking up at them and things like that. But yeah, it's one of those that's like, I think you're definitely right. I don't necessarily think about it as much, but it's nice that I'm able to sort of present the Swedish side of me. But yeah, I think one I always find funny is people always confusing Sweden with Switzerland as well. I feel like that one
I did
comes
that
up.
to start with.
Not all of us are perfect, I'm joking.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, I do get it, because it's like, I mean, they begin with the same two letters. So yeah. But yeah, I think, and it's like they're both fairly snowy climates, depending on. I mean, I'm sure there are more similarities, but there are obviously a lot of differences as well.
What I feel like was quite like surprised me when I was Sweden is the lack of tea. Like I could not find a decent cuppa in Sweden anywhere. The only like recognizable like brands of tea that I saw was Lipton, and Lipton is not a proper builder's English cup of tea brand. So I remember, because they're very big on coffee, aren't they?
Yeah, I was going to say they're like they have the words escape me now, but it's the tradition of sort of like afternoon coffee is very much ingrained in.
Yes, I read about that recently. I'm trying to remember what I could get my book right now.
Fika, that's it.
Yes, that's the one.
I remember because I got my family some coasters with that written on it. So I was trying to picture. But yeah, so that's kind of describes like an afternoon coffee. You'd always have like some coffee and cakes, really, pretty much every afternoon. That was one thing my dad very much liked about Sweden. But yeah, I think it's just obviously the act of that is nice in its own right, but also just because it's a way of talking to each other. And I think from what I've heard, I think some workplaces almost do have that as well, of like in the office they would like offer it with as fairly like standard, like obviously not for like hours and hours, but for like 10-20 minutes just to sit down and have a little break.
Because what I've read about, and again, this is from like reading, it's not from necessarily like my experience or experience you might necessarily know, but what I've read is that in the workplaces, when you're like working, you are working, like you are, there's no, you know how like if you stepped into like a British office, there'd probably be a bit of like natter and a little bit of like conversation, where from what I've read, it's very kind of formal in terms of in Sweden, when you're working, but then they have this dedicated time to step away fully, have a treat, and like, because I feel like they're very much about, in Sweden, they're very much about enjoying like the simple pleasures, and so having like a designated kind of breakaway, which is that Fika,
yeah. I think again, like I haven't necessarily worked in Sweden and haven't spoken to people who do too much, but I think from what I've heard from when like my mum worked in Sweden and things like that, that does seem to be aligned in terms of how they do it. Like while you're working, you very much are, but as soon as you're finished, you're done. Obviously, if you own your own business or whatever, it's different. But for like most employees and things like that, it's like once you're done, you're done. You shouldn't really be doing anything outside of it.
Yeah,
and it's that
good
sort of
boundaries.
balance. And another thing that they have as well in regards to like the working and things, I was talking to my mum about the other day, was the like paternity and maternity leave and things like that you get, because I think it's something like you get, I'm not going to know the exact, I think it's like 400 or something days between the mother and father, so any either can take it off, and you have to like, you're essentially forced to take that off, and then you get paid up to like 80% of your salary while
That's
you're
so
on leave for like
good.
that entire time. So again, if you've only got like one person who was working in that family before then anyway, that's just like 400 days on one of them. But otherwise you can split it as you want, but it's not like the UK where it's like for maternity leave it's a bit more generous than it is if it's paternity ones.
Yeah,
it's
it
like,
is.
which is, it still feels a bit archaic to me.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because every family and situation is different,
Well,
isn't
exactly,
it? But
yeah.
I definitely feel like there's a lot of room for improvement of how we look after each other during like life-changing situations.
No, exactly. And I'm aware that's a bit of a segue, but it's just one of those other things that kind of got me thinking about other differences.
So let's, coming back to it then, in terms of your, so obviously you grew up in like Essex, England, with your mum and your mom more like right there, didn't you? So they were like in your life like their whole life. So how did their kind of like Swedish influence form your like normal day? Like how did you notice any kind of like day-to-day Swedish influences from that kind of thing?
I think the biggest one is like a fairly decent understanding of at least the basics of the language, because I remember my mum and mum would speak in Swedish pretty much all the time, like on the phone or to each other in person, especially about things that like if they didn't want me to know about them when I was younger, they'd just speak to each other in Swedish. And I remember that they told me like one story about when they were like talking to each other about, I think it was a Christmas present or some sort of surprise for me in Swedish, and then I responded in English to like what they were saying, because I was like, I could understand them, I was in the room with them, and then they both sort of like looked at each other and looked at me and they were like, didn't know you understood us. And I think that was like, I rumbled it, because I think I remember there were a few other things I'd found out from that and just hadn't said anything. But I just for whatever reason said it that time. So yeah, and I can still understand quite a lot when they're speaking it, and I think I've got a good understanding of their way of speaking Swedish. But it's like any other country, Sweden has different like regional dialects depending on where you are, and I'm not the person to describe what those are, but my mum's kind of explained to me like why, oh, if you're not understanding this person, it might be because they're speaking in this way. And then once she said it, it's like, oh yeah, they say like certain letters a different way or things like that. So yeah, I think that's one way that's kind of influenced me from very young. And I think they did sort of try to help me learn Swedish when I was younger. But whenever they did, I'd always, as much as I don't like myself for this, I always told them to speak properly whenever they started speaking Swedish.
The disrespect.
Like I started trying to teach it to me. So yeah, I know.
But you needed to learn some, didn't you, to keep, because you have a dual citizenship.
Yes, I have a dual citizenship, and I had to renew that in when I was 21. So that was a couple of years ago. And as part of that, you need to like prove that you have a strong enough connection to Sweden to keep it, because obviously with being born, having a mother who's Swedish, that's kind of enough to get it for you at the beginning. But to keep it beyond that, you need to prove that you actually made an effort, because understandably they don't want people just saying like using the citizenship for whatever if they never go to the country, never interact with it, or never see any family or friends or whatever. So that was a whole process to go through of renewing that. And it's one of those things that if you renew it in the UK, it costs quite a lot of money and you have to go through a whole effort with it. But if you renew it in Sweden, I think it's fairly chill, of just like you just go into the post office or wherever, or police station I think it might be, and then just say like, I want it renewing, and they're like, okay, and then just
stamp
it. But it might be different for this one anyway, because it's like the one at 21 is the you have to kind of prove a stronger connection for that one specifically. So I had to go in. I had a long list made by my mama, which was very kind, of all the times I've been to Sweden.
She was on it.
All the dates, all the people we'd been to see, where we'd been, and all that. So all I had to do all I had to do was learn enough Swedish to kind of get through speaking most of the kind of interview that they do when you're in there. And I think it was all right. I think there were some parts of it when they were speaking, I was just kind of like, can you repeat that? Sorry. But I wanted to like try and keep them speaking Swedish as much as possible, which they were, because that's another thing in Sweden is a lot of people are taught English from a very young age and taught in a way that I think it's not quite comparable to the way that we're taught languages in England, because it is like you're kind of taught it to speak it, whereas I feel like you're taught other languages in English to kind of know how to answer the tests and things, and then it's not that applicable. So pretty much everyone speaks English who's been brought up in Sweden. So that's one thing that I've noticed whenever I'm over there is like you'll start trying to speak Swedish to someone, and if they even have a hint that you're English when you're speaking to them, they'll just start speaking to you in English, and you're just like, okay, well, I give up now.
Stops you being able to practice.
Yeah, but it also, in fairness, for them, they probably don't get to use it a ton, so it's an opportunity for them to practice it again. So I do get it, but sometimes like I'm trying to learn, please.
So what kind of festivities and celebrations of like come from like your Swedish heritage do you feel like? Because I know that there's a few different things throughout the year that you celebrate that are Swedish.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of them kind of, I'll start with the ones around Christmas because they're the ones that have had the most sort of impact in my life, really. And the first one is Lucia, which is 13th, he says, of December.
I think so.
Yeah, and that's based on Saint Lucia. Now has the song that goes along with it.
Do you want to sing it?
No. I always remember it was using a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and that's where I learned it from. Interestingly enough. But yeah, it's a festival. Oh, it's not a festival, but it's a holiday where traditionally you would there'd be like a kind of event where a woman would wear like a ring of candles around it, or a crown of candles on their head, and like carry a candle, and then there would also be like other women carrying candles, and then traditionally like men with these sort of big kind of pointy hats and things like that, who'd be carrying either like a star wand or a candle as well. And a lot of it does date back to traditions surrounding Saint Lucia. Again, I'm not the expert on what those exactly are, but how it's celebrated is that. And I always remember we had some little figures around Christmas that would always come up kind of depicting those three different roles, and they'd always go on the mantelpiece. So that's where I kind of learned what all the figures would look like. And I think there's some photos somewhere of like my mum participating in that, and like either carrying the candles or like wearing the candles on her head. And they still do it in like, especially in schools and things, they do it a lot with kids, not always with real candles anymore, understandably. But yeah, it's just a really nice one, and it's kind of like, I think it's bringing light into a period of the year where it can be quite dark a lot of the rest of the time. So it's nice to have that sort of light coming into it through that way. Another one that is kind of part of it is the Advent candles. So it's like for the 4 Sundays before Christmas Eve, because that's another one that I'm saying out loud that is different as well. I think it includes Christmas Eve. That's not really important.
It probably is to them.
It probably is. So it's not important to explaining the story, but to the general holiday it is. Thrown off. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so for the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas, you have these 4 candles that are in some form of holder, and they're all next to each other, and then you light one candle each Sunday, and then they'll all kind of form like a staircase pattern as you go of like you will light the previous one and the current one, and that as you go. And at least in my family, it was a good tradition to meet up to light one of those candles each Sunday, and then have some Fika as well. So have some coffee and cake while you're doing it. I don't know if that's part of it or if that's just a family thing, but yeah, it's a nice way to kind of celebrate counting down to Christmas. And alongside that, you've got the other sort of candles with all the different numbers on it, from like 1 down to 24, and then you burn that each day as well. But I never quite know if that's Swedish specific, or if that's just something
There's
that's more
a few
general.
different places I think that do that. Or I think there might be like a religious tie to some of it, possibly.
Yeah, I think a lot of it obviously does because it's Christmas, but yeah, I'm not sure of the exact. No, I don't know as much around that one as I do around like Lucia and things. And another big one is celebrating Christmas on the evening of Christmas Eve instead of Christmas Day morning, as is obviously traditional in the UK. I think I remember like I didn't even realise that it was different until I kind of got to primary school. I just assumed that everyone did it that way, and then I would be like, I'm opening my Christmas presents on in the evening, and then people were like, what are you talking about?
I bet everyone was so jealous.
Yeah, I always made a point of it of like, oh, I know what presents I got before you. But then also you have to wait the whole day to open your presents, and they're all under the tree and things, and you're like
just waiting.
Yeah, so like it feels like the longest day of the year when you're a kid, and you're just like, please let me open the presents. I think so much to the point that my parents would usually let me open like one present the night before just to kind of tide me over.
Yeah, we did that, but that's you open one present on Christmas
on the
Eve
24th,
and then
yeah.
you open everything else Christmas Day morning. But again, I know people that are English and celebrate and open presents at different. Everyone has like a different day. I was going to ask if the meals that, because I know your family do like kind of different kind of meals, so I'm wondering if that's specific to Sweden or your family.
I think it's a bit of both. I think it started out as like a tradition in Sweden because they don't really do like the kind of the big
British roast
dinner with the turkey and everything is like a traditional Swedish one. But equally, I'm not entirely sure of what it is. I think it's more of like a buffet style thing in Sweden, really. So people would
picky bits.
Yes, in the lightest sense of the word. No. So I think the way it works is like you'd have various people. Obviously, you'd kind of come together with family, and like everyone would kind of bring a dish or two of things to kind of have, and then everyone would kind of have from everything. But there's some things, especially like my mama would bake some like Swedish style bread, and then earlier on, I used to help out with her making something called pepperkaka, which are like closest things I can compare them to are like ginger snaps, really.
Yeah.
But they're also if you go to IKEA, you'll see the boxes of them in there around Christmas. But yeah, we'd always make them, and she'd have about like 30 different cutters of like different shapes, and there'd be like all your standard ones, and you have like the shooting star and the pig.
A pig?
Yeah, that was a pig one. And other like like little Christmas tree ones and stuff like that.
Amongst the pig,
yeah.
Was
the
there
pig
any
ones are
other
my
farm
favorite.
animals, or
Yeah, there were sheep as well. I think there might have been a donkey one, and there was also like a man and a woman shaped one as well. So yeah, the whole variety.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that would be a whole day leading up to Christmas as well. It was a ordeal. I think myself and my mama would kind of take turns of doing it. Like one of us would start it off and the other would end it, and then Mama would just be there the whole time for like the 6 hours. No, she'd be doing most of it. We'd be the ones that have been like helping out. But then she does the most of it. So yeah, again, a lot of it's around Christmas. Obviously, Midsommer is the other kind of popular one, Midsommer,
which is around your dad's birthday, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
The summer solstice.
Summer solstice is when it's celebrated. Yeah.
I just can't. I just can't not think about that movie.
Oh yeah.
That now.
I feel like I think about them in separate terms. It's a good movie, but
it ruined it for me.
Not entirely accurate to what happens.
I'm absolutely scarred.
Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of got a lot of some of the traditions that overlap with England. Like you kind of got like the maypole type situation, and then the dances around that, and I'm realizing a lot of things are just kind of like buffet style, but like it would be like
picky bits.
But more buffet style, like meals with family and things like that. But it's not one that I've ever really been to formal like celebrations of, so I'm not as much of an expert in.
I'd love to go to like a proper, especially like Midsummer. To be fair, I'd love to go to like actual events for all of the Wheel of the Year. But I feel like Midsummer in Sweden would be really special.
Yeah, need to time it one year. Go to like some family event because it'd be really fun.
Yeah. Well, that was quite a lot then.
I was going to say, I'm looking at it, it feels like we've been chatting for not too long, but I'm like, it's 44 minutes now.
Yeah, I still have questions, but I'll leave them for another time.
Yeah, we can do a Sweden part 2 if the people are clamoring for it, or if we just feel like doing it.
And if anyone's asking, I've got any particular questions as well, of course, just
if my mum or my mum are listening, I'm sure they'll have comments to correct me or add other things that I've completely forgotten to mention. So if they do mention that, we'll definitely bring it up another time we do it.
We'll have a more episode.
Yeah, she'll be able to answer everything so much better than I have. So she's a real expert.
So before we head off, let's just finish up with our wellbeing segment. So what is something that has brought you joy or a boost in wellbeing this past week?
Something that's brought me joy this week is I had one of my friends come to visit this weekend, and it was a really nice time. We had a really fun evening together, and calling with another friend as well, doing virtual escape room, and that was a really fun time. And then just going out to a nearby abbey and having a nice little wander around and a little time in the cafe. I feel like time in the cafe is always good for anyone's health. Yes, so that's it's brought me joy this week. What about you?
Well, I suppose similarly, I had a call with a friend I haven't spoken to in quite a while.
Busy social week for us.
So that's busy. But yes, I had a video call with Kat, who I know from my uni days, and we haven't spoken in like properly in quite a while. So it was just really nice to actually just get to sit down and have a natter and quick catch up. And just get all the updates all in one go.
Yeah, you need to just have a big old debrief of everything that's happened.
Yeah, literally. So that was really lovely.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's probably my joy of this week. And then what is something you or I can do for your well-being in the next week, or what's your intention for the next week?
To start off, I think my intention for next week is start working on the garden again. I think that's a big one. I mean, not just that, obviously, but we wanted to get it in a place where we've got a lot of stuff ready to at least start being planted in a few weeks' time. And we've still got a fair bit we need to do. We've got our fences all up, finally.
Yeah.
At least in the back garden. Don't ask about the front one. But yeah, so that's kind of come along. So I think just clearing out all the garbage that's been there since we moved in, and some of it's piled up since we moved in. So just making it nice and kind of ready to be niceified, or any better word that you could think of than improved is a good one. So yeah, that's my intention. So I think for that, it's just making sure that we're reserving the more physical energy to actually be ready to kind of get all of this stuff around and get it down to the tip and sorting it all out in that sense.
Yeah, I feel like February is already flying by.
Yeah, it's insane. It's already been over a week into it now.
Yeah.
When we're recording.
So I think my intention for the week is just to kind of have a bit of a kind of sort out of plans and things, because there's a few kind of things up in the air and spinning around, and then obviously there is the garden. So I kind of want to just sit down and get a bit of an idea of time ahead, really, and especially with doing a few more sessions now as well. Hopefully after this week I'll have a bit more idea of what my regular sessions are going to be like, so it'd be good to get kind of a bit of a routine going, as well as a plan of all the many things that we
have to do, or not have to do, that we want to do,
that we have on our list. So yeah, that's everything for me, I think.
Cool.
So we will sign off now, but as always, if there's any comments, questions, topics, or whatever you want to do, it's always really lovely hearing people's comments about episodes and just podcast in general. So please do share them, and we will send you lots of love and warmth, and we will see you next time.
See you then.